For the tens of thousands of Massachusetts residents on probation or parole, life outside of prison can feel painfully similar to life behind bars, under constant observation and threat of reincarceration. Now, new leadership at the state's parole and probation systems is looking to change that. I'm joined now by one of those leaders, Pamerson Ifill, Commissioner of Massachusetts Probation Service, along with David Delvalle, a returning citizen who's now on probation after serving 7.5 years in the Department of Corrections, and Investigations and Impact Editor for the GBH News Center for Investigative Reporting, Paul Singer. Singer, thank you. Everybody, thank you for joining us today. Really appreciate that. Singer, tell us, what are these changes?
Well, what we've found is that the people we've been speaking to who have experienced incarceration or probation and parole had been telling us that it's sort of a trail them, nail them, and jail them. They felt like they were just being pursued again. But it is clear that Commissioner Ifill, and he can talk a little bit about it for himself, and the parole commissioner are trying to make significant changes where their agencies can become more service-oriented, helping people succeed in the communities rather than just waiting for them to trip up and go back inside. At least, and again, I'll say this, when Commissioner Ifill was telling me this the first time, I thought, okay, well, that's a nice thought. That sounds like a pleasant idea. But then we actually dug up some data that indicates they may actually be doing it, which is sort of a nice surprise for those of us who track government.
Commissioner, what are the changes that you're trying to make?
So, I think for us, are the changes that we're really focusing on. And it isn't just me as commissioner. I think it's the entire trial court, judges as well. But the goal here really is to see how we as an organization or how we as a trial court can really improve their lives and the trajectory and outcomes for people. And so when we talk over the last several years, and this goes back to Chief Justice Ralph Gantz, God rest his soul, back in 2015, brought together the entire court as well as judges and leadership to address issues of racial and ethnic disparity, but also outcomes and access to justice. And so this is part of that ongoing focus about how we as a probation service and how we as a trial court focus more on the delivering of services to individuals, reducing the number of violations, reducing incarceration rates, and then really improving outcomes for people who are on probation. And I think, look, our data tells us that our violations are down. Massachusetts is, we had the Pew Center for States as well as this Council of State Governments come in here in 2018 and 19. And they rank Massachusetts as, if not the #1 state, one of those states that sends the fewest individuals back to prison or jail from probation violations. So I think everything that we see, all of our data tells us that this approach is working.
David, how did you experience the system?
My experience with the probation system changed a lot depending on the county where I'm from. I started in Worcester County, and I moved to Middlesex County, and now I'm currently in Suffolk. And I noticed that the way I was treated was different from place to place, depending on their staff. And when I had first gotten out, I was dealing with Worcester County. And I remember, asking them, I want to be a full-time student. I want to change my life through education. And they were like, absolutely not. We need you to be employed. And I just remember feeling like if I didn't conform to whatever they said, I was going to have to face the consequence of going back to prison, which was honestly anxiety-invoking, and I felt like all the hard work I did working on my education was going to go to waste. Thankfully, I was able to do both, but I didn't feel like I was able to have that control over my life and my rehabilitation like I wanted to.
But there were counties that were better.
As I got to Middlesex, they were a little bit better, but still not as lenient and welcoming. And then once I got to Suffolk County, I don't know if they're a lot more familiar with higher education or how things work in that area. Maybe they see a lot more men of color trying to do better. But they actually offered me resources. And that was something that was so humanizing to me. Wow, a probation officer actually offered me a program that was going to better me and better my education. I never had that before throughout my entire existence with probation.
This is a really interesting point that we keep hearing from because we've been interviewing people now for 2 years who are returning from some justice having caught a case basically, and it invariably comes back to, well, it didn't go well until I met that probation officer or that parole officer who gave a damn. The other ones didn't care. They didn't care. They treated me like whatever. And we got a quote from a guy just last week. He said, I got lucky because my PO wasn't a complete jerk. Well, that shouldn't be
That should not be the bar.
That shouldn't be the bar,
Yeah.
right? And Commissioner, I know that you and I talked a little bit about this, part of this is a culture that has to kind of permeate the whole agency.
Commissioner, when you hear that story, I mean, how do you respond to it?
So look, as I hear David speak, one of the things that I'm really interested in, and do apologize for those initial, sort of interactions or perceptions about how probation is functioning across different spectrums and different counties. And so part of what I embarked on and we're working on is really looking at policy, practice, and protocol to really make sure that we have consistency across the board in every court and every probation department. I used to be chief probation officer of Suffolk Superior Court, so I understand there's a lot of focus around programming, and I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in Middlesex or in Worcester, because I think it does. As David talks about his different experiences, those are the things that we're trying to better understand to try to get the level of consistency there. But everything that he asks for is not that difficult for us as an organization to work through, whether it's education, employment, housing. We have gotten better, and we will continue to get better at that. So, again, I apologize for those initial experiences, but I'm happy to hear that he is in a place where he's finding the kind of support and services that will ultimately allow him to, flourish as somebody who's on probation and trying to improve his outcomes in his life.
David, what's the most useful thing that the system could do for a returning citizen?
The most useful thing that the system can do for a returning citizen is be a resource. Allow that person to have say in their rehabilitation. Allow that person to be able to negotiate the terms of them coming back home through probation, and have probation be an outlet to be able to reach out to other resources, because people will listen to the probation department in a way that they wouldn't, because they're an authority figure. So it's like they feel like they're an obstacle all the time to the average person coming home. It shouldn't feel that way. You should be able to go to your probation department and seek a resource and seek guidance through these problems that average people have to deal with.
And we've talked about that, actually. And I think the Commissioner, you and I talked about this back in January, that could you have the conditions of your probation negotiated rather than set by the court themselves? Is that something, Commissioner, is that kind of thing that can happen?
So we're working, Paul, we're working really. I've got a working group now that are really taking a hard look at only having in place those conditions of probation that are needed and necessary to get somebody to, one, be compliant with the court orders, but also be able to be successful. And so part of that is really looking to have conditions that are set in the affirmative where an individual is really engaged in that conversation, the decision. That's not always going to work, because not every, cases, all of the different types of cases will typically require different types of responses. But we are hoping that, again, that part of the challenge we have right now, we have conditions that are imposed, and we do an assessment, and then we get individuals to think about what it is that they really want to work on. And I'm hoping that as we evolve and develop a system, that we can really try to analyze and evaluate before the disposition of cases, or when after that decision is made by a judge whether a person is found guilty or by a jury. We want to be able to figure out from that individual what are sort of some of the things that they really need, what are some of the services that we can provide, how can we support individuals. So I think all of these are things that we're looking to build a system that is more adaptive, more not just culturally competent and sensitive, but really get to understand. We talk about risk, needs, responsibility. We really need to identify needs first and then think about responsibility and risk. And I think if we can continue to think about how we flip that on its head, I think we might hear the kinds of things that would be helpful to David and some of the things that you were talking about, Paul.
David, I mean, you get a chance to speak to the Commissioner right now. What are the needs that would be that are most pressing that could help you as a returning citizen?
Paul said something that really resonated with me. So, Commissioner, I'd like to ask you, how do we humanize the relationship between probation officers and the people on their caseload? Because it seems like there's an adversarial relationship that kind of stems through whether it's people's fear with probation officers, police officers, or correctional officers. And it seems like, I don't know if it's the title officer that holds that same way, or is there something we could do like a restorative justice practice that can kind of soften that relationship?
So, David, more often than not, all of our probation officers are individuals who are invested in looking to improve the outcomes of the individuals that they're supervising and working with. So, look, we fundamentally believe that that is the most important aspect between the probationer and the probation officer, that ability to build trust, build empathy and understanding, and build respect. And those are sort of the conversations that we're having, across the system. And so wherever we are not meeting that benchmark, it is my intent that we address that, whether it's through training, through levels of accountability. But our goal is to ensure that the most important aspect of the probation officer respect is the level of respect shown between the two. We've moved away, and I've talked to you, Paul, about this, about the whole concept of, as you mentioned, trail, nail, jail them. We're really interested in we're hiring probation officers who understand substance use disorders, mental health, behavioral issues, employment. I mean, we're spending $15 million now a year in housing, not your normal probation kind of things that probation departments are doing. We're much more vested in the behavioral health component of this work. We are enrolling people in mass health to try to get people's services up front. David mentioned Suffolk Superior Court. Suffolk Superior Court has assigned a probation officer to every department of correctional facility so that we can build relationships and connections with individuals who are being released from incarceration. So I think we are approaching a lot of the things that we are doing. We just launched a massive mentoring initiative because we want to make sure that all of our probation officers have the best types of skill sets. And we spent the last 2 years training around issues of racial and ethnic disparities and treating individuals as customers as opposed to, more often than not how we see individuals as criminal or criminally inclined. So I think we're making the kinds of things that David would like to see in probation officers. And as we continue to find where that isn't working well, we'll address that.
And I'll also say, just if I can, that I spoke with Mr. Gomez, who oversees the parole officers, and the conversation was very similar. Is that this really is a trend that they're trying to push through the whole process?
Well, this is an ambitious cultural change effort, but hopefully it'll help lots of our returning citizens and the state as a whole. Pamerson Ifill, David Delvalle, Paul Singer, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Commissioner.